The morning air at Cheltenham Racecourse crackled with anticipation. The annual aristocratic horse auction was more than just a tradition. It was a battleground, a spectacle where reputations rose and fell with the strike of a gavel. Outside, the crisp autumn sun danced on the dew-laden grass, casting a golden sheen across the parade ring. Inside, however, the true drama was just about to begin. Victoria Ashworth's heart pounded as she walked through the marble foyer, her cane tapping rhythmically against the tiles. Heads turned, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain. The faint scar curving down her left cheek glimmered under the overhead lights, a stark reminder of the battlefield she'd left behind, but never truly escaped. She caught her reflection in a polished window, straightened her shoulders, and pressed forward. Every step was a declaration. She belonged here, no matter what the old guard whispered. A flurry of whispers rippled through the crowd as she entered the main arena. This wasn't just any event. Today was the day Shadowmere would be auctioned, the black thoroughbred that had haunted headlines for months. Even now, he stood isolated in a glass enclosure, towering and regal, his midnight coat catching the light like living obsidian. The bulletproof glass, installed after the incident, glinted coldly. A security guard stood nearby, hand never leaving his radio. A woman in a tailored navy suit leaned toward her companion, voice just loud enough to be heard. "That's Lady Victoria Ashworth. Back from Afghanistan, I heard. Poor thing's never been the same since her father died." Victoria ignored them, gaze locked on Shadowmere. For a moment, everything else faded. The horse was magnificent, every muscle taut with silent fury. His nostrils flared, eyes wild, yet heartbreakingly intelligent. She saw something in him that echoed within herself, a being both wounded and unbroken, defined not by their scars, but by what they had survived. The auctioneer, a portly man with a waxed mustache and the booming voice of a carnival barker, began the proceedings. The opening lots passed quickly. Yearlings, broodmares, each fetching tidy sums. Then came the hush as Shadowmere's name was called. The tension was palpable. People shuffled nervously. The stories had spread like wildfire. Shadowmere had killed a stable hand. He'd trampled Lord Blackwood himself. He was cursed, mad, untamable. "Lot 47, Shadowmere," the auctioneer announced, slamming his gavel. "Royal bloodlines, but, some behavioral issues, as you all know." A hesitant opening bid, £1,000, echoed from the back, only to be met with silence. Another pause. Then someone snickered. "Who'd be mad enough to take that thing home?" Victoria inhaled slowly, pulse steadying. She raised her hand, voice clear and unwavering. £1. For a second, the room froze. Someone laughed, sharp, derisive. Lord Edmund Blackwood, impeccably dressed and radiating entitlement, leaned over the railing, sneering. "You're not serious, Lady Ashworth. That beast isn't a charity case. He's a menace." Victoria met his gaze. "Perhaps the problem isn't the horse, Lord Blackwood, but the hands that held the reins." A hush fell. The auctioneer fidgeted, then shrugged theatrically. "Well, if there are no other bids—" A flurry of whispers. Someone in the front row started to object, but Blackwood silenced them with a look. In the silence that followed, Victoria walked toward the glass enclosure. The security guard tensed, but she lifted a hand, palm out. Shadowmere's ears flicked back, nostrils trembling. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, impossibly, Shadowmere stepped forward. He pressed his forehead gently against the glass, eyes fixed on Victoria's. It wasn't fear or aggression she saw. It was recognition. A broken spirit meeting another, both searching for a reason to trust again. Behind her, laughter faded to stunned disbelief. The auctioneer cleared his throat, a little shaken. Sold, to Lady Ashworth, for £1. Victoria signed the paperwork, each stroke of the pen echoing like a drumbeat. A staff member unlocked the glass enclosure, voice trembling. "Are you sure you want to do this, ma'am? He's unpredictable." She nodded, moving slowly, speaking softly to Shadowmere as she approached. "I'm not here to control you, old friend. I'm just here to listen." Shadowmere stood perfectly still as she slipped a halter over his head. When she tugged lightly, he followed, muscles tense but yielding. The gasps and murmurs of the onlookers grew, but Victoria shut them out. As she led him out of the enclosure, a man stumbled out of her way, nearly tripping. Someone else snapped a photo, flash blinding in the dim light. Victoria led Shadowmere through the exit, the hush following them like a shadow. The doors swung closed behind her, shutting out the stares, the judgments, the laughter. Outside, the morning sun was brighter. The world somehow changed. She ran her hand down Shadowmere's neck, feeling the tremble beneath his skin. Fear, hope, exhaustion, all tangled together. For a moment, they just stood there. Two survivors, alone but together. She heard footsteps behind her. Colonel Hartwell, her old comrade, watching with wary respect. He nodded just once. She exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down, but something inside her began to lift. She whispered, "Let's go home." And for the first time in months, Victoria felt the faintest flicker of hope. The road back to Ashworth Manor wound through the misty Cotswolds countryside, flanked by ancient stone walls and golden fields that seemed to stretch forever. As the old pickup truck bounced over a pothole, Victoria glanced at the horse trailer behind her in the side mirror, half expecting Shadowmere to have broken loose. But no, he was there, silent, huge, and calm, every so often pressing his nose against the slats, as if to reassure himself that this wasn't another trap. The moment at the auction replayed in Victoria's mind over and over. The shock on those aristocratic faces, the brittle silence, the way Shadowmere had met her gaze and chosen trust over fear. Something in her chest ached, as if she'd met an old friend she never knew she'd lost. The lane to Ashworth Manor was cloaked in fog, the manor's ancient gables barely visible above the trees. Every return here stirred memories, sharp and unbidden. When Victoria was a child, she and her older brother Rupert would race ponies down this drive, his laughter echoing across the fields. Even now she could almost hear it, rising above the steady rhythm of the truck's engine. But that laughter had been silenced long ago, on a bright June afternoon, when a rearing stallion and a careless handler had left Rupert lifeless in the paddock. That single moment had carved a canyon through the Ashworth family, a wound that never truly healed. Victoria remembered standing at the edge of that chasm, the taste of loss bitter in her mouth, her mother sobbing, her father turned to stone. It was grief that drove her to join the army, grief that pushed her into the desert heat of Afghanistan, chasing danger because it dulled the pain. But war brought its own scars. She remembered the roar of the explosion, the sudden brightness as an IED tore through the ground beneath her, the blur of dust and blood and bone. She remembered waking up in a hospital, face bandaged, leg broken, metal on her bedside table, a metal that felt heavier than the shrapnel lodged in her memory. People called her a hero, but she never believed it. Sometimes, late at night, the ghosts of lost friends gathered at the foot of her bed, silent and accusing. She'd spent so long running from her past, from Ashworth Manor, from herself. She parked the truck near the old stables. The building was a relic, ivy strangling the stone, paint peeling from the doors, a memory of a brighter era. As she opened the trailer, Shadowmere snorted and stamped, eyes rolling, but she spoke softly, murmuring nonsense words, and he quieted. The stables smelled of earth and hay, and as she led him inside, Victoria felt the weight of years pressing down. This place had seen too many ghosts. That evening, as rain pattered against the windows, Victoria sat in the empty parlor, tracing her fingers over old photographs. Her father in his regimental uniform, Rupert at his first pony show, her mother laughing in a sunlit garden. The manor was quiet except for the distant rumble of thunder. The silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional neigh from the stables. She wondered if she had the strength to heal this place, or herself. But the next morning, the past reared its head in a different form. A thick envelope was waiting on the doorstep, sealed with crimson wax and stamped with the crest of the Blackwood family. Victoria broke it open and scanned the contents. Legal threats, demands for the return of Shadowmere, veiled accusations. She recognized the elegant handwriting. Lord Edmund Blackwood. He'd been her neighbor since childhood, always more interested in power than people, always collecting rare horses the way others collected art. Rumor had it he'd once tried to buy Shadowmere's dam for a fortune and had never forgiven the Ashworths for refusing. Victoria's hands shook with anger. She tossed the letter aside and walked out to the stables. Shadowmere watched her approach, head high, ears pricked forward. He looked different here, less wild, more wary, as if waiting for something to happen. Victoria leaned on the half-door, her voice low. "They think you're just a prize, a possession to be fought over. But I see you, old boy. I know what it means to be used up and thrown away." That afternoon, as she brushed Shadowmere's glossy black coat, she noticed scars on his flank, old wounds, long healed, but ugly and deep. She found herself talking aloud, telling him stories of Rupert, of the accident, of Afghanistan, her words tumbling out in a quiet confession. In the hush of the stable, Shadowmere listened, unmoving except for the gentle flick of his tail. At one point, his great head lowered, nostrils touching her shoulder, warm breath ghosting over her skin. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, Victoria's eyes stung. She let the silence stretch, feeling something uncoil within her. As dusk crept across the fields, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton arrived. The old housekeeper had served the Ashworth family since before Victoria was born. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. She handed Victoria a mug of strong tea, her voice gentle. "You did a brave thing, my dear, bringing that creature home. Not everyone sees the worth in something that's been hurt." Victoria smiled, grateful for the company. They talked late into the night. Mrs. Pemberton revealed that Shadowmere's reputation as a killer was built on lies. She'd heard whispers from the Blackwood staff about the real story. Shadowmere had been brutalized, goaded into rage, not by madness, but in self-defense. Lord Blackwood's cruelty was an open secret among the servants, but nobody dared speak out. That night, as Victoria walked through the halls of Ashworth Manor, she felt the gravity of her decision. She had brought home a living mirror of her own pain, a creature accused, misunderstood, wounded, but still standing. She paused at an upstairs window, gazing at the moonlit stables. Somewhere below, Shadowmere shifted in his stall, and the sound echoed through the house like a heartbeat. She whispered, almost to herself, "We're not broken. Not yet." The next morning, a new resolve filled her chest. If Blackwood wanted a fight, he'd have one, but on her terms. Shadowmere would not return to a life of torment. Victoria would rebuild what had been lost, not just for herself, but for the legacy of Ashworth, and for every wounded soul that called this old manor home. The first light of dawn swept over Ashworth Manor, bathing the ancient stone walls and endless green fields in a gentle gold that seemed to promise healing. Victoria stood at the window of her father's old study, staring across the mist-wreathed paddocks and the weathered 18th-century stables that had been empty for far too long. The silence of the place felt both comforting and heavy, full of memories and hopes she could barely name. Her breath misted the glass, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope, just a little, that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild something here. Down in the yard, the first real challenge of the day waited. Shadowmere had spent his first night at Ashworth Manor quietly enough, though she'd checked on him 3 times, expecting panic or an escape attempt. But he had only watched her from the shadows of his stall, his eyes reflecting the lantern light, his body tense but still. Now, as she crossed the dew-soaked grass to the stables, she heard him snort, stamping restlessly. She paused at the door, inhaling the sharp, sweet scent of hay, and let her voice carry softly, "Morning, old friend." Inside, Shadowmere's dark form shifted. The stable, though old, was sturdy, the beams marked by centuries of use. She moved slowly, careful not to crowd him, simply lowering herself to sit outside his stall, back against the wall, arms resting on her knees. She talked about anything and everything, the taste of her mother's blackberry jam, the sound of church bells across the village on Sundays, the way her brother had always cheated at hide-and-seek. Sometimes her words trailed off, her voice catching on old hurts, but Shadowmere listened, every muscle taut with attention. She didn't try to touch him or force him into work. Instead, she just shared the quiet, letting trust build in silence. Hours passed this way for days. The rhythm of healing was slow, deliberate. Some mornings, Shadowmere grazed in the paddock, while Victoria sat beneath an oak tree, reading aloud from books that had belonged to her father. Adventure stories, poems, anything with a heartbeat. At first, Shadowmere kept his distance, but bit by bit, he crept closer, drawn by the steady sound of her voice, until finally, one afternoon, he lowered his head beside her shoulder. Victoria froze, then smiled, the fragile thread of trust growing stronger. The manor itself began to stir back to life as well. Mrs. Pemberton dusted off the kitchen and aired out the faded curtains, humming softly as she worked. The scent of baking bread began to fill the halls again. Sometimes Victoria would find her in the rose garden, pruning overgrown bushes and reminiscing about the Ashworths' grand summer parties. "This place needs laughter again," the old housekeeper said one morning, pausing to wipe her brow. "It needs hope." It was a few days later that Thomas Fletcher entered the picture. A small, quiet boy with a shock of unruly brown hair, often trailing after his father, the head gardener. Thomas was the sort of child who seemed half-wild himself, more comfortable among animals than people. Victoria noticed him lingering by the stable doors, eyes wide as he watched Shadowmere. When she called him over, he hesitated, but curiosity won out. "He's not as scary as they say, is he?" Thomas asked, voice barely above a whisper. "No," Victoria said. "He just needs someone to understand him, like we all do." Thomas grinned, a gap-toothed smile that made him look years younger, and offered Shadowmere a carrot. To their surprise, the great horse took it delicately from his palm, lips brushing the boy's fingers. It was a small miracle, and Victoria felt something shift, a bridge forming, not just between her and Shadowmere, but between her and the world outside these walls. In the weeks that followed, Thomas became a constant presence at Ashworth Manor, his shyness melting away with every day spent among the horses and gardens. He brought news from the village, gossip, weather, the arrival of new foals at neighboring farms. More importantly, he became Victoria's link to the people she'd once thought had turned their backs on her family. Through Thomas, she learned of Mrs. Healy, who remembered her mother's kindness, and old Mr. Parsons, who still talked of her father's racing days. The community that had once seemed so distant now began to edge closer, curiosity slowly replacing suspicion. Victoria continued her patient ritual with Shadowmere, never forcing, always waiting. Some days he was calm enough to let her brush his neck, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Other days he shied from sudden sounds, the scars on his flank rippling as memories of past violence returned. Victoria understood those days better than anyone. Sometimes, in the stillness of dusk, she would confess her own fears to him. Her guilt over Rupert's death, her nightmares from the war, her uncertainty about the future. Shadowmere would listen, silent and steady, and she found comfort in his presence. There were setbacks, of course. One morning, a thunderstorm rolled over the manor, shaking the windows with its fury. Shadowmere panicked, rearing and kicking at his stall until Victoria raced down and threw open the doors, her voice cutting through the noise. "It's all right. You're safe now." He stilled at the sound of her words, sweat darkening his coat, chest heaving. She stood beside him in the rain, not trying to control, only to calm. The storm passed, leaving them both trembling but unbroken. As summer melted into early fall, Ashworth Manor began to look less like a relic and more like a home. Flowers bloomed in the once neglected gardens, and the fields rang with birdsong. Shadowmere, once called a monster, now moved freely in his paddock, always returning to Victoria's side at dusk. Thomas and Mrs. Pemberton became fixtures in her new, fragile world, proof that healing was possible, even after years of silence and sorrow. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange behind the hills, Victoria stood with Shadowmere by the paddock gate, Thomas skipping stones nearby. She reached up and let her fingers rest on the great horse's neck, feeling the powerful muscles shift beneath his skin. For the first time in a long time, she let herself believe, truly believe, that they could build something good out of all this pain. She whispered, "We'll find our way together." And in the deepening twilight, Shadowmere nuzzled her hand, as if he believed it too. The late summer sun poured through the windows of Ashworth Manor, washing the old walls with honey-colored light. For years, the estate had been a place of silence. Its grandeur faded, its halls echoing with loss and rumors. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with little things. The laughter of a child skipping across the gravel drive, the bright colors of flowers newly planted by the garden gate, the whinny of Shadowmere. No longer a sound of fear, but one of greeting. Victoria felt the changes ripple outward, like rings in a pond, reaching far beyond the ancient stones of her home. Each morning, Victoria made her way to the stables, sometimes joined by Thomas Fletcher, who had become as much a fixture of the manor as the ivy climbing the south wall. Thomas's energy was infectious. his stories about village life coloring the air as they worked. He'd tell Victoria about the blacksmith's new apprentice, about Mrs. Healy's stubborn goat, about how the kids at the Bourton-on-the-Water school dared each other to sneak a peek at the ghost horse behind the Ashworth gates. Victoria laughed more easily now, though her smiles still held a trace of sadness. Healing, she realized, was not a straight path. On days when the memories pressed too close, she found solace in her routine, feeding Shadowmere, brushing his coat until it shone, sitting with him in the paddock and reading aloud. Thomas would sometimes nap in the sun nearby, the boy and the horse equally at ease in her company. Word about Victoria and Shadowmere's odd companionship trickled into the village, growing with each telling. At first, the stories were sharp-edged, about the Ashworth woman gone strange, about the murderous horse and the ghosts that haunted the manor. But gradually, the tone softened. One afternoon, as Victoria and Thomas led Shadowmere along the bridle path by the river, they encountered a group of local children peering through the hedge. Instead of running away, Victoria smiled and waved, and Thomas called out, "He's not scary, you know, just big." The children edged closer, curiosity overcoming their fear. Shadowmere, for his part, remained calm, his massive head lowering to accept a tentative pat from the bravest of the bunch. Laughter erupted, bright and unexpected, and suddenly the boundaries between Ashworth and Bourton-on-the-Water seemed less absolute. It wasn't only the children who noticed. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, ever watchful, began to appear more often in the village, shopping at the market, visiting the church. She spoke fondly of the changes at the manor, how Victoria was bringing the old place back to life, how even the devil horse had been tamed by kindness. She told stories of the Ashworth's glory days, of garden parties and races and a sense of belonging that had once been the heart of the community. People listened, and old grievances faded, replaced by a flicker of hope that maybe the past could live again in new ways. One warm evening, Mrs. Pemberton sat with Victoria by the fire, knitting in her lap. "You know, my dear, when I was a girl, your family opened these doors to everyone. There was laughter here and music, and even the horses seemed to know they were part of something bigger. I see that spark coming back. You should be proud." Victoria swallowed hard, emotion thickening her voice. "I'm trying, Mrs. Pemberton. Some days I wonder if it's enough." The old woman's eyes twinkled. Healing isn't about erasing scars. It's about finding a way to live with them. Victoria looked down at her hands, the skin marked by old burns and new calluses. She understood now that she couldn't change the past. Not Rupert's death, not her own wounds, not Shadowmere's suffering. But she could shape what came next, for herself, for the horse, for everyone drawn into their orbit. The community's attitude shifted in other ways, too. One Saturday, as Victoria cleaned the paddock fence, Colonel James Hartwell arrived, his weathered face breaking into a rare grin as he surveyed the scene. He'd served with Victoria overseas, and though the war had changed them both, their bond remained unbroken. "You've done something remarkable here, Vic," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself." She laughed. "You doubted me, Colonel? I doubted the world, not you." He studied Shadowmere, who eyed him warily from the shade. "Ever think about doing more with this? Not just for yourself, but for others like us?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Equine therapy," Hartwell replied. "You know, using horses to help veterans with PTSD, wounded folks, People who can't quite find their way home. You and that horse might have more to offer than you realize. The idea took root, tentative but insistent. Victoria turned it over in her mind for days, imagining Ashworth Manor not as a mausoleum for lost dreams, but as a sanctuary, a place of second chances. She and Hartwell talked late into the night, sketching plans, debating logistics, daring to hope. Meanwhile, news began to swirl. Lord Blackwood, furious over the loss of Shadowmere, was not finished. Whispers reached the village, of legal threats, of pressure on the magistrate, of Blackwood's determination to reclaim what he saw as his property. Tension hummed beneath the surface, a warning that peace was never simple, that darkness lingered at the edge of even the brightest days. Victoria confided in Mrs. Pemberton, who patted her hand. That man's cruelty is known by all, but no one's had the courage to stand up to him, until now. Victoria squared her shoulders. I won't let him hurt Shadowmere again, no matter what it takes. Outside, the village pub buzzed with speculation. Old men at the bar placed bets on whether Victoria would hold out, while younger villagers whispered about the changing winds at Ashworth. For the first time in years, the community found itself united by something other than fear or gossip, by the hope that a broken place and a broken family might be made whole again. As twilight settled over the manor, Victoria walked out to the paddock, Shadowmere meeting her at the fence. She pressed her forehead to his, feeling the steady beat of his heart. We're not alone anymore, she murmured. And with the stars blooming overhead and the laughter of Thomas echoing from the garden, Victoria realized that the world, and her place in it, was transforming, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, into something filled with promise. The morning of the court summons dawned gray and cold, the kind of English day when even the birds seemed to have lost their spirit. Victoria woke to the sound of distant thunder rumbling across the hills, a storm brewing both in the sky and in her life. On the kitchen table, the crisp white envelope with the Blackwood seal glared at her like an accusation. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it again, though she'd already memorized every line. Lord Edmund Blackwood, with all the subtlety of a hammer, demanded Shadowmere's immediate return. He claimed theft. He hinted at scandal. He threatened consequences that stretched beyond courtrooms and crept into the shadows of reputation and legacy. Mrs. Pemberton stood at the stove, back rigid, pouring tea with a firmness that betrayed her nerves. You'll need to dress the part, Lady Victoria. They expect us to come crawling, but you'll show them who's the real Ashworth. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. Victoria forced a smile, but doubt gnawed at her. She had never loved the world of barristers and silk-tied legal games. She was a soldier, not a chess master. But there was no choice. Shadowmere's life, and in many ways her own, hung in the balance. The news spread quickly through the village and beyond. Bourton-on-the-Water hummed with whispers as the date approached. Victoria walked through the market one morning, heads turning, voices lowering as she passed. Some offered nods of support, others eyed her with suspicion or even fear. Old wounds reopened, fueled by Blackwood's influence and relentless campaign to paint her as an unstable woman harboring a dangerous animal. Pamphlets circulated, painting lurid pictures of the monster horse and the mad woman of Ashworth Manor. But Victoria refused to hide. She prepared her defense with the help of Colonel Hartwell, who summoned contacts from his army days. A sympathetic solicitor from London, an equine behavior expert, and a battered, dog-eared file of Shadowmere's veterinary records. Mrs. Pemberton brought out old ledgers and estate papers, searching for anything that could tip the scales in their favor. On the eve of the trial, Victoria found Thomas Fletcher in the stable, kneeling in the straw beside Shadowmere. The boy stroked the horse's muzzle, his voice soft but fierce. "Don't let them take him, Lady Victoria. He's not bad. He's just scared." Victoria knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder. "I won't let them, Thomas. But I'll need your help. We all have to be brave." The royal courts of justice in London rose above the city like a fortress. Inside, marble floors gleamed, echoing with the footsteps of barristers and judges, the air thick with tradition and privilege. Victoria walked through the halls, her head held high, scars visible and unhidden, Shadowmere's fate in her hands. Across the aisle, Lord Blackwood sat flanked by a phalanx of lawyers, his smile tight, predatory. The proceedings began with formality and cold politeness. Blackwood's team spun their tale. Shadowmere as a savage, irredeemable animal, Victoria as an unstable, reckless veteran, unfit to care for herself, let alone a dangerous beast. Documents appeared, some real, some forged, all painting Ashworth Manor as a ruin, its mistress as a liability. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Moore, fought back with logic and patience. She presented records of Shadowmere's lineage, photographs of the horse at peace, testimony from veterinarians who'd seen the healing transformation under Victoria's care. Hartwell spoke of Victoria's courage, of her ability to calm Shadowmere with nothing but her voice and her will. But the battle was uphill. The judge, an old friend of Blackwood's father, raised an eyebrow at every defense, his tone skeptical. The air in the courtroom thickened with tension. Victoria's heart hammered in her chest as witnesses spoke, some with compassion, some with bitterness. It was on the third day that everything changed. Thomas Fletcher, trembling but determined, stood to testify. His clothes were neat, his hair carefully combed by Mrs. Pemberton that morning. He looked so small on the stand, but his voice rang clear. "When I saw Lord Blackwood hit Shadowmere with a whip, he hurt him, and Shadowmere was just trying to get away. He wasn't angry, he was scared. I saw it all." The courtroom murmured, shocked. Blackwood's lawyer objected, tried to rattle the boy, but Thomas stood his ground, tears shining in his eyes. "You can say whatever you want, but I know what I saw. Shadowmere isn't bad. He just wants to be safe." The judge called a recess, visibly shaken for the first time. Outside in the hallway, Victoria hugged Thomas, her voice cracking as she whispered, "You were braver than any soldier, Thomas. Thank you." The trial adjourned pending further investigation. Suddenly, the world felt different. Blackwood's mask of certainty slipped, his threats now tinged with desperation. The villagers, hearing of Thomas's testimony, rallied to Victoria's side, voices rising in defiance of the old power that had ruled for too long. Victoria returned to Ashworth Manor that night, exhaustion and hope warring inside her. She fed Shadowmere in the quiet dark, stroking his neck as she whispered, "We're not done yet." In the glow of the lantern, the scars on his flank seemed less harsh, the world a little softer, the future, just barely, tilted in their favor. Night fell hard over Ashworth Manor, smothering the countryside in velvet darkness. The full moon cast long, cold shadows over the fields and painted the ancient stone walls silver. Inside, the manor was quiet, but not peaceful. There was a crackling edge in the silence, as if the whole house was holding its breath. Victoria moved from window to window, checking the latches, her body tense with anticipation. The trial was not over. Blackwood had lost his composure, and his threats, once whispered, had become open warnings. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind rattling the panes, made Victoria's nerves jangle. She lingered by the stables, whispering to Shadowmere as he shifted in his stall. The big black horse seemed to sense the change too, ears pricked and restless, nostrils flaring with every unfamiliar sound. Victoria stroked his muzzle, murmuring, "It's all right, boy. I won't let anyone hurt you." Yet even as she spoke, she wasn't sure she believed it. Blackwood was relentless. When he couldn't win with money or lies, he would turn to violence. She'd seen it before, in men who thought they could buy the world and bend it to their will. Just after midnight, the peace shattered. The crunch of tires on gravel outside, too quiet for any friendly visit, sent Victoria sprinting down the hall. She caught the glint of flashlights, the low mutter of voices, shadows moving with military precision along the edge of the yard. Her pulse hammered in her ears. This was no drunken trespass. This was a raid. She grabbed her father's old hunting rifle, more for show than real protection, and raced out into the night. In the cold moonlight, 3 men in black balaclavas fanned out, one heading toward the main house, 2 slinking toward the stables. Victoria fired a warning shot into the air, her voice cutting through the night. "Get off my land, now!" The men hesitated, startled, but didn't retreat. Instead, they moved faster. The one nearest the stables produced bolt cutters and snapped the padlock in seconds. Victoria sprinted across the yard, heart pounding. She reached the stables just as the men burst inside. Shadowmere screamed, a wild, furious sound that split the darkness. The men tried to rope him, shouting and cursing as the huge horse reared and kicked, eyes rolling with terror. Victoria didn't hesitate. She hurled herself at the nearest intruder, knocking him sideways. The second man lunged, grabbing her arm, twisting until pain shot up her shoulder. "Let go," she gasped, jamming her elbow into his ribs. The man stumbled back, but the third advanced, fist raised. Shadowmere exploded from his stall, hooves striking the boards. Victoria broke free and scrambled to the horse's side, grabbing his mane. In the chaos, a lantern crashed to the floor, flames licking at the straw. "No!" Victoria shouted, kicking the lantern away, stomping out the sparks. The men cursed, realizing their plan was falling apart. One shoved her hard. She hit the stall wall, the impact rattling her teeth, pain lighting up her leg where old wounds had never fully healed. She clung to Shadowmere, ignoring the pain. "We have to go, now!" The big horse, panic thrumming through his body, let her vault onto his back. There was no time for a saddle or reins. The men swore, scrambling to block the exit, but Shadowmere plunged forward, barreling through them like a storm. Victoria ducked low, holding tight as he burst out of the stables and into the night. The moonlit fields stretched before them, lavender glimmering silver, hedgerows casting jagged shadows. Behind them, shouts rang out. The men were chasing on foot, but Shadowmere was faster, his stride eating up the ground. Victoria pressed her face into his neck, urging him onward. "Go, Shadowmere, go!" They tore across the meadows, wind burning Victoria's eyes, every muscle in her body straining to stay balanced. The pain in her leg worsened with every jolt. Then, a hidden rut caught Shadowmere's hoof, and he stumbled. Victoria slipped, her bad leg twisting as she fell hard into the grass. She bit back a cry, rolling clear just in time as Shadowmere spun back to her side, frantic. Behind them, flashlights bobbed and curses echoed. Victoria forced herself up, leaning on Shadowmere for support. Her leg throbbed, fire shooting through her thigh. "Easy, boy," she whispered, clinging to his mane. "We're not done yet." With a Herculean effort, she pulled herself back up, wincing as her injured leg protested. Shadowmere moved carefully now, as if understanding her pain. They made for the woods, the ancient trees of the Cotswolds rising like sentinels. Branches slapped at Victoria's face, darkness swallowing them whole. Still, she pressed on, heart pounding. She could hear the men crashing behind, but they were losing ground, tangled in brambles and roots. Deep in the woods, Shadowmere slowed, sides heaving, his coat slick with sweat. Victoria slid down, collapsing against his shoulder. She could barely breathe, every nerve alight with adrenaline and fear. Somewhere far off, the shouts faded. For a long time, she and Shadowmere just stood in the silent dark, the bond between them forged stronger by terror and trust. Victoria fumbled in her pocket for her phone, hands shaking. She called Colonel Hartwell, her voice ragged. "They came, Colonel. 3 men, masks, tried to take Shadowmere. We're in the woods by the north field. I'm hurt, but we're safe for now." Hartwell's answer was swift. "Stay put, Vic. I'll bring help. You're not alone." She hung up, burying her face in Shadowmere's neck. The big horse nickered softly, pressing against her as if to anchor her in the present. Tears pricked her eyes, not just from pain, but from the knowledge that she was fighting not only for her own future, but for his, for the promise that had grown between them. The first faint light of dawn crept through the trees as the sound of distant sirens and friendly voices finally reached her. Victoria let out a shaky breath, relief and exhaustion mingling. Help was coming. They had survived the night. And as Shadowmere stood watch over her, Victoria realized that sometimes courage was nothing more than surviving until the sun rose again. Morning crept slowly across the Cotswolds, sunlight splintering through the thick branches and dappling the leaf-strewn forest floor where Victoria and Shadowmere had taken refuge. The pain in her leg still throbbed, a deep, hot ache that flared every time she tried to move, but it was softened by the sound of friendly voices pushing through the trees. Colonel Hartwell appeared first, flanked by local police and several men from the village, their faces drawn and worried, but brightening the moment they caught sight of her and the horse. "Victoria, thank God!" Hartwell knelt beside her, his old soldier's hands gentle as he checked her leg. "Help's here. You did good." Shadowmere stood solid and silent, letting the rescue party surround them without a flicker of fear. The villagers stared at the great black horse, so often the subject of rumor and dread, but what they saw was not a monster, but a guardian. The story of the midnight attack raced through Bourton-on-the-Water by noon, igniting something fierce and protective in every home and shop along the high street. The pub filled with angry voices. Even the schoolchildren pressed their faces to the windows, whispering about the bravery of Lady Victoria and her shadow horse. By the time Victoria, battered and limping, made it back to Ashworth Manor, supported by Hartwell and Mrs. Pemberton, the manor's drive was crowded with neighbors. Some she barely knew, some she'd avoided for years, but all were there. Mr. Parsons, the old gardener who once grumbled about city folks ruining everything, pressed a basket of fresh apples into her arms. Mrs. Healy wiped her eyes, declaring, "We won't stand for it, Lady Ashworth. We won't let him win." Even the vicar, rarely seen outside his chapel, arrived with a prayer and a flask of whiskey, muttering, "For courage and for standing together." The attack had struck a nerve deeper than Victoria expected. She'd always believed the old boundaries between the manor and the village were impenetrable, but now, faced with Blackwood's brute force, those walls crumbled. One by one, people stepped forward with offers, sleeping in shifts to guard the estate, loaning their dogs, setting up lanterns and bonfires at every entrance. Colonel Hartwell organized the veterans from neighboring villages, men and women who knew too well what it meant to fight for a cause. They posted themselves in rotation, their presence a silent warning to anyone who dared approach with malice. It wasn't just adults. Thomas Fletcher, who had witnessed more than any child should, took his place at Shadowmere's side, refusing to leave. At dusk, he led a group of children with homemade banners and pots and pans, banging out a cacophony of defiance along the stone wall. "If they come back," Thomas declared, chin set in stubborn determination, "they'll have to go through us first." For the first time since returning to Ashworth, Victoria felt a warmth grow inside her. Not just the simple relief of safety, but the deep, soul-shaking realization that she was no longer alone. It was a strange, beautiful sensation. All her life she'd carried her scars in secret, believing she had to bear them alone, but now, as the village closed ranks around her, she saw that pain, shared, became lighter. The boundary between manor and village, between outsider and kin, had blurred. Even Shadowmere, once the focus of fear, became a symbol of unity. One evening, Victoria limped out onto the lawn to find the villagers gathered around bonfires, laughter and music filling the cool air. Mrs. Pemberton served hot cider and scones. Hartwell sat on a fallen log, telling stories of Victoria's courage in Afghanistan, embellishing where it suited him. "She stared down death more times than any of us," he boasted. "And look what she's brought home, a legend and a second chance." Victoria sat quietly beside Shadowmere, who nuzzled her good leg and allowed the children to braid ribbons into his mane. She watched as old feuds faded into the glow of the firelight, suspicion replaced by solidarity, the past receding before a promise of something new. Even Mrs. Healy, who had once campaigned to have Ashworth's gates locked for good, pressed a kiss to Victoria's cheek and whispered, "Your father would be proud, love. The whole town is." Still, tension lingered in the air, a thread of unease that no amount of cider or song could erase. News traveled fast. Lord Blackwood, undeterred by legal delays, had vowed to reclaim Shadowmere by any means. There were rumors of another attempt, of lawyers and hired thugs, but the villagers refused to bend. Each night more people arrived, farmers, teachers, former rivals, offering what they could, refusing to let fear dictate the future. In the quiet after midnight, Victoria walked the manor grounds, lantern in hand. She paused by the paddock where Shadowmere grazed under the watchful eyes of two veterans and a sheepdog. She leaned against the fence, the pain in her leg throbbing, but her heart steadied by the sight of the community she'd once thought lost to her. Shadowmere lifted his head, ears flicking, and for a moment the two survivors regarded one another in perfect understanding. "We did this," Victoria whispered, voice barely audible over the breeze. "Not just you and me, all of us." The moon rose high, silvering the roofs and hedgerows, casting long shadows over a village that had found its voice. Ashworth Manor, once a lonely outpost, now pulsed with life and purpose. Victoria let herself believe for the first time in years that they might just win, not through force, but through unity, resilience, and the kind of courage that only grew stronger when shared. And as she turned to head back inside, lantern swinging gently at her side, she realized the truest kind of strength wasn't in facing danger alone, but in knowing, at last, that you never truly had to. The wind howled over Ashworth Manor as the sky churned with low, heavy clouds, casting the Cotswold hills in a bruised twilight. For days the village had stood guard, but unease thickened the air. It was only a matter of time before Lord Blackwood made his move. Victoria felt it in her bones, the way a storm announces itself with pressure and the smell of rain. She spent each night pacing the halls, peering through the curtains, heart pounding at every unexpected sound. Shadowmere, sensing the tension, stood vigilant at the paddock gate, ears always twitching, muscles taut beneath his midnight coat. On the third evening after the attack, as the last embers of the communal bonfire faded and most of the villagers drifted home, headlights cut a path through the dusk. A sleek black sedan rolled up the drive, tailed by 2 Range Rovers. The vehicles hissed to a stop in front of the manor, doors snapping open. Blackwood stepped out first, crisp and arrogant in a bespoke suit, a folded paper in his hand. A court order, or so he claimed. His lawyers flanked him, faces stony, their confidence a veneer stretched thin over nerves. Victoria squared her shoulders as she limped out to meet them, refusing to show fear. The villagers, some holding lanterns, others wielding shovels, bats, or nothing at all, fanned out behind her in a loose semicircle. Colonel Hartwell stood at her right, arms folded. Thomas clung to Mrs. Pemberton's hand, his gaze fixed on Shadowmere. "Lady Ashworth," Blackwood called, voice slick with triumph. "By order of the court, you are to surrender the animal to my custody. Further resistance will be met with criminal charges." His words rang out, cold and official, but Victoria could see the desperation burning in his eyes. She faced him squarely, refusing to blink. "You come here with threats and lies, Blackwood, but you forget. This isn't your world to rule. Not anymore." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Pemberton, who had watched the Ashworth family rise and fall for decades, stepped forward, brandishing a leather-bound journal. Her voice was surprisingly strong. "I have something you ought to see, sir." She opened the journal, revealing pages yellowed by time. "This is Lord Henry Ashworth's diary, Lady Victoria's father. It records every offer you ever made to buy Shadowmere's dam. It details your anger when the family refused. And here," she jabbed a finger at a page, "it spells out your threats. Your promise to ruin the Ashworths and claim the horse by force if you had to." The villagers pressed closer, curiosity burning. Blackwood's lips curled in a sneer, but sweat beaded on his brow. "You expect anyone to believe the ramblings of a dead man and his servants?" Hartwell stepped forward, voice like gravel. "The diary matches statements from your own stable hands, who've already given testimony about the night Shadowmere was injured. If you want to test your luck, let's bring this to the authorities. Or would you prefer to walk away now?" Blackwood blanched. For a moment he seemed to shrink in his tailored suit, his certainty fracturing in the face of united resistance. But he wasn't done. He thrust the paper forward. "This order is legal. I have the right—" Victoria didn't let him finish. "You have no right here. Not after what you did." Her voice rang out, steadier than she felt. "This community has suffered enough. Shadowmere stays with me, with all of us, where he's safe. And you—" She took a step closer, eyes never leaving his. "You will answer for what you've done, in court and before the world." Blackwood sputtered, lawyers jostling around him, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The villagers closed ranks, the line between nobility and commoner erased by purpose and loyalty. Flashlights and phone cameras flickered. Every face shone with defiance. Just as the tension peaked, the sound of sirens rose in the distance. Police vehicles wound their way up the lane, blue lights strobing against the darkness. The lead officer, already briefed by Hartwell and Mrs. Pemberton, strode up to Blackwood. "Sir, you are under investigation for animal cruelty, conspiracy, and attempted break-in. You'll come with us for questioning." Blackwood's composure cracked. He cursed and tried to pull free, but the officers were implacable. One of his lawyers attempted to protest, but was silenced with a glare from the crowd and a warning from the chief. Blackwood was led away, shouting threats that sounded smaller and smaller as the police cars disappeared into the night. For a long, stunned moment, no one moved. Then someone laughed, a light, almost disbelieving sound, and soon others joined in, laughter swelling and bouncing off the ancient stones. Tears streaked Mrs. Pemberton's cheeks. Hartwell clapped Victoria on the back. Even Thomas ran to Shadowmere, hugging the horse's massive neck. "Is it really over?" Thomas asked, voice trembling. Victoria crouched beside him, one hand on Shadowmere's mane. "It's over, for now. He can't hurt us anymore." She looked up at the gathered faces, some tearful, some grinning, all changed by what they'd seen and done together. "We stood up for what's right. All of us." As the police left and the last of Blackwood's entourage faded into the dark, the village broke into celebration. There was music, an old accordion dragged out of the pub, fiddles and voices joining in. Food appeared as if by magic. Mrs. Healy poured cider into tin cups. People danced, held hands, and let their children race along the manor lawns. The darkness was chased away by lanterns and laughter. Victoria stood with Shadowmere at the edge of the party, her pain forgotten. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the steady pulse of life. For the first time in so many years, Ashworth Manor belonged not just to her family, but to everyone gathered there. She whispered, "We're safe, old friend. You're home." Shadowmere leaned into her, gentle as a memory, and the night air brimmed with hope and possibility. In the days after Blackwood's arrest, a rare peace settled over Ashworth Manor. The news traveled fast, across Bourton-on-the-Water, through the villages, and up to London itself. Blackwood's downfall became the talk of every market, every pub, every kitchen. Yet for Victoria, the greatest change was not in the world's eyes, but in the quiet transformation unfolding within the walls of her home and the boundaries of her own heart. Mornings came softly now, sunlight spilling over the paddocks where Shadowmere grazed, his great body loose and easy in a way Victoria had never seen before. The terror and suspicion that once tightened his muscles had melted away, replaced by a cautious but real sense of security. Some days he would gallop the length of the field, mane flying, nostrils flaring as if he were reclaiming the right to joy itself. On other mornings, he'd wander to the fence where Victoria sat with her tea, lowering his head to accept a gentle stroke, both of them breathing in the crisp, new air of freedom. Victoria spent hours each day in the stables or walking the grounds, but not alone. More and more the villagers came, not out of curiosity, but to take part in something they now understood. There were veterans who'd served with Hartwell, haunted by memories they rarely spoke of, and they found comfort in brushing Shadowmere or simply leaning on the fence, watching him move. There were children who once trembled at the sight of the monster horse, now bringing apples and giggling as they helped braid his mane. And there were others, Mrs. Healy, Mr. Parsons, the vicar, who visited just to sit, to breathe, to share silence that felt healing rather than heavy. One bright afternoon, Victoria gathered a group in the old parlor, veterans, townsfolk, even some of the younger children who'd grown attached to Shadowmere. She poured tea and listened as Hartwell spoke about the invisible wounds soldiers carried home, about how sometimes the hardest battles were fought long after the guns had fallen silent. He nodded toward Shadowmere grazing beyond the window. That horse was broken by cruelty, same as men can be. But look at him now. He's not just surviving. He's living again because someone believed he could. Victoria felt the truth of those words deep in her bones. She looked around the room, seeing reflections of her own pain and hope in every face. She cleared her throat, voice quiet but steady. We spend so much of our lives trying to control what scares us, horses, memories, people. But healing doesn't come from control. It comes from listening, from patience, from seeing what's really there instead of what we fear. The words hung in the air, simple but resonant. Mrs. Pemberton squeezed her hand, eyes brimming. Thomas piped up from his place on the floor. And from being brave, even if you're scared, like Shadowmere. The laughter that followed was soft, genuine, a balm for old wounds. The weeks that followed saw Ashworth Manor transformed further. Inspired by Hartwell's suggestion, Victoria began turning one of the outbuildings into a therapy center, a place where veterans, trauma survivors, and anyone struggling with invisible pain could come to work with horses, learn from their patients, and find community. The project drew volunteers from all over the Cotswolds, people eager to help paint, repair fences, and share in the sense of purpose that now radiated from the estate. Shadowmere became the symbol of it all. His story spread online and in local papers, the so-called killer horse who became a healer, not by being tamed, but by being understood. More than once, Victoria caught him standing at the center of a small circle, children petting his sides, a wounded veteran resting a forehead against his shoulder, someone weeping quietly into his mane. He gave no judgment, only presence. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Victoria stood beside Shadowmere in the golden light. She spoke softly, words barely above a whisper. We're all wounded in one way or another. But being wounded doesn't make us weak. It just makes us human. And sometimes, it's the wounded who know best how to heal. The horse nickered, as if in reply. The old pain in Victoria's leg flared, but she stood tall, letting herself feel the ache without shame. It was a reminder of battles fought, of things lost, and of everything that could still be rebuilt. Later, as she addressed a small crowd during the center's first open day, Victoria shared her philosophy. We can't erase the past, but we can choose how we live with it. Healing is never about forgetting. It's about respect for ourselves, for each other, for the lives and stories we carry. Shadowmere isn't a pet. He isn't a lesson to be taught. He's a partner. He's proof that with patience and compassion, even the most broken things can find new life. The message rippled through the crowd. Some wept, others smiled. The sense of solidarity, of shared purpose was tangible in the air. That night, as stars pricked the velvet sky and the manor lights glowed softly across the lawn, Victoria sat with Mrs. Pemberton and Hartwell on the terrace. They watched as Thomas chased fireflies, laughter trailing behind him, while Shadowmere grazed nearby. We did good, didn't we? Victoria said quietly. Mrs. Pemberton patted her hand, a smile deepening her wrinkles. You did, love. You and that horse. You showed us all that real healing is about love and listening and never giving up on each other. Victoria closed her eyes, letting the night sounds wash over her. The wounds would never fully disappear, but in this place, at this moment, she felt whole. And as the wind stirred the grass and Shadowmere lifted his head to the stars, Victoria knew the hardest lessons were also the most beautiful. Those who are hurt, the deepest, often hold the most power to heal, if only they are given the chance and the trust to do so. The years passed quietly, as all great chapters do after a storm. The wounds left by Lord Blackwood's cruelty faded into stories told by firesides and in classroom lessons, reminders of a past that shaped but no longer defined Ashworth Manor or those who called it home. The manor itself, once silent and battered by grief, transformed into something alive, something beautiful. The stones gleamed brighter, the gardens flourished, laughter drifted from every open window, and the smell of bread and earth and sunlight seemed to settle in every room. Victoria's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined on that first desperate day at the auction house. The therapy center was no longer just an idea, but a vibrant, beating heart in the center of the Cotswolds. Each week, veterans arrived from across the United Kingdom, some hobbling on crutches, others hiding their wounds behind quiet eyes. Children with trauma, families broken by loss, people whose scars could not be seen by the naked eye, all came to Ashworth for a new start. The horses, led by Shadowmere, met them with patience and strength. No one forgot Shadowmere's story, how he had survived cruelty, earned suspicion, and then become a symbol of resilience for everyone who felt too damaged for this world. Under Victoria's gentle guidance, the horses learned to trust again, and so did the people who worked with them. There were setbacks, always. Days when a veteran would collapse in tears, or a child would bolt from the paddock in fear. But each time Victoria and her team responded with the same compassion, the same listening that had saved her and Shadowmere from the brink. The villagers had made the healing center their own as well. Mrs. Healy baked every week for the staff and clients. Colonel Hartwell ran support groups for new arrivals, his gruff exterior hiding a deep well of understanding. Even the children of Bourton-on-the-Water, who had once feared the demon horse, now volunteered on weekends, teaching new kids how to feed carrots and braid manes. Thomas Fletcher, a little older now, helped run riding lessons, his confidence a living testament to what patience and kindness could do. One bright spring morning, a crowd gathered at the edge of the village green. A bronze statue stood shrouded in velvet, a powerful horse rearing skyward, mane whipping back, eyes full of fire and defiance. The inscription read, "Shadowmere, symbol of courage and healing." Victoria stood at the base, hand resting on the polished metal, her own scars on proud display. Thomas stood beside her, Mrs. Pemberton nearby, and the whole community pressed in close. A hush fell as Victoria began to speak, her voice clear, steady, reaching not just the crowd, but everyone who might hear her story in years to come. We built something here, all of us, not out of strength alone, but out of understanding, out of listening, out of giving each other a chance. Shadowmere wasn't healed by force or by fear. He was healed by respect, by trust, by the simple act of believing that no one is beyond hope. This statue isn't just for him, or for me. It's for every person and animal who ever felt broken. You're not alone, and you're not finished. Sometimes the most wounded souls become the greatest healers, not because they're never afraid, but because they know what it means to be seen and loved, scars and all. The applause was thunderous, echoing across the green and up to the manor. Children ran forward, tracing the lines of the statue, their laughter a promise that the lessons learned here would live on. News crews snapped photos, and soon the story of Ashworth Manor's transformation and Shadowmere's legacy traveled far beyond Gloucestershire. Victoria was awarded honors for her work, first local, then national. She was invited to London to receive the title Dame Victoria Ashworth, a formal recognition of her service to the nation's veterans and her pioneering approach to healing. The ceremony was grand, but Victoria wore her riding boots beneath her dress, and as soon as it was over, she hurried back to the manor, to her people, and to her horses. One summer evening, with the smell of lavender and cut grass on the breeze, Victoria sat on the hill above the manor, Shadowmere beside her. The old wounds in her legs still ached, but she no longer saw them as marks of defeat. She watched as the sun dipped below the rolling fields, casting everything in gold. Thomas joined her, sitting cross-legged in the grass. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't come home, or if you hadn't taken a chance on Shadowmere?" Victoria smiled, eyes shining. "All the time. But that's the thing about second chances, Thomas. You don't see where they'll lead when you begin. You just have to trust that every small act of courage, every decision to listen instead of judge, opens a door for someone else." The boy was quiet, thinking, then asked, "Do you think people like us, people with scars, can really make a difference?" Victoria rested a hand on his shoulder. "I think we're the only ones who truly do, because we know what it costs and what it means to keep going. That's what legacy is. Not perfection, not power, but kindness, resilience, and the willingness to try again, no matter how hard the world tries to break you." As dusk settled, villagers began to gather for the evening meal. Tables laid out under strings of lanterns, the sounds of music and happy voices spilling out across the lawn. Mrs. Pemberton called from below, and Colonel Hartwell waved, a plate in each hand. The sense of belonging was as real and tangible as the cool grass beneath Victoria's palms. Shadowmere nickered, nudging Victoria's arm, and she stood, moving slowly but surely, letting herself be part of the world she and her friends had built from the ruins of old pain. And as the stars blinked awake and the statue of Shadowmere caught the last of the light, Victoria whispered to herself, "Sometimes the most broken spirits carry the brightest light, not because they've never known darkness, but because they have, again and again, and still, they choose to heal." With a heart full of gratitude and hope, Victoria joined her community, her family, her herd, knowing that their story was not ending, but beginning again in every life Shadowmere's legend would touch.